You could tell what kind of week it was by the sandwich in the lunchbox. If it was fried egg, payday wasn't far. If it was ketchup and butter, the cupboard was near empty. These weren't meals. They were survival. And to the men who ate them, they were sacred. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Egg drop soup with scraps. This wasn't a recipe, it was a last stand. When all you had was a broth base, a couple vegetables, and one egg, you made egg drop soup. Water and bouillon made the broth. Maybe there was a real chicken carcass left from Sunday. More often, it was just hot, salty liquid with a few scraps of onion, celery, or carrots tossed in from the back of the icebox. The egg was the magic. Whisked in a bowl, then poured slowly into the boiling broth while stirring, it turned into silky ribbons that swirled around like something elegant. A dash of pepper gave it bite. A little vinegar or soy sauce if someone had traveled far enough to pick some up. Served in mugs or soup bowls or whatever was clean, it didn't look like much. But it was warm, nourishing, and felt, just for a moment, like a real meal. And sometimes that moment was enough. Bread pudding. With raisins, dinner or dessert, you didn't throw bread away. Ever. Even when it was hard enough to break a window. You tore it into chunks, soaked it in milk and eggs, and made something out of nothing. Bread pudding wasn't just dessert. Some nights it was all you had for dinner, and you were grateful for it. You stirred in sugar, a dash of cinnamon, and a handful of raisins if they hadn't been eaten straight from the box. Everything got dumped into a greased pan and baked until golden on top and soft in the middle. The smell was warm and sweet, and by the time it hit the table, no one cared. It had started out as stale scraps. You could drizzle syrup over it, add a knob of butter, or just eat it straight with a spoon, warm or cold. It filled your stomach and soothed the rest of you too. Bread pudding was comfort disguised as frugality. It was how you turned ends into beginnings, and how you remembered that hunger could sometimes be outsmarted by memory and a little sugar. Navy bean soup with salt pork. This wasn't a soup for sipping. It was a soup for working. Thick, salty, and heavy. Navy bean soup was built to keep you going when the pantry and paycheck were both running dry. You soaked the beans overnight, softened them up, then dropped them into a deep pot with chunks of salt pork, cheap, fatty cuts that gave up all their flavor as they simmered. Onions and maybe a carrot went in too. Garlic, if you had it. But it was the salt pork that made the difference. Melting down, fat rendering into the broth, meat turning tender. It cooked for hours. By the end, the beans were soft, the broth was golden, and the smell filled the whole house like a promise. You served it thick with cornbread, if you had it, or just a torn-off slice of white bread to chase it down. Navy bean soup didn't waste anything. It didn't pretend. It just showed up hot, hearty, and ready to do the job. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup. Biscuits didn't need butter to be good. They didn't need buttermilk, fancy flour, or anything from a store shelf marked luxury. They needed flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and a good hard dollop of cold lard, cut in with fingertips that knew the work of real kitchens. You mixed the dough by hand, rolled it rough, and cut it into thick, squat rounds that hit the oven like promises you had to keep. They baked up craggy and hot, smelling like every good thing you still had left. When they came out, you split them open with your hands, no knife needed, and spooned sorghum syrup into the steamy middle. The syrup oozed into every crack, soaked through the crumb, and sweetened the air with the smell of warm sugar and hot bread. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup were sticky, messy, and heavy enough to carry you through 2 chores and a skipped lunch. They weren't about celebrating. They were about surviving, with a little sweetness in the hard times. And sometimes that was enough to lift a tired family 1 more mile down the road. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches. It was called a sandwich, but it was mostly a leaf and a prayer. You took a slice of iceberg, crunchy, cold, and barely green, and laid it on soft bread. Spread mayonnaise on both slices, just enough to make it feel like you had something creamy, something richer than you really did. You bit down through softness and crunch and told yourself it was fresh, light, maybe even good. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches were summer meals for empty kitchens. They made the most of the produce drawer and the bottom of the mayo jar. And for a little while, they made you forget how little you had. Rice pudding as dinner. When meat ran out and vegetables were too expensive, rice pudding stepped in, sweet, heavy, and warm. It was one of the few dinners that felt like a treat when you had nothing left to treat yourself with. You boiled white rice until soft, then stirred in milk, sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt. If the cupboards were kind, you added cinnamon or a handful of raisins. If they weren't, you made do. You let the mixture simmer low until it thickened into a creamy, sticky comfort, something between a dessert and a survival plan. Sometimes an egg went in to make it richer. Most times it didn't. You spooned it into bowls and ate it slow, letting the warmth settle into your bones. Rice pudding didn't care that it was dinner. It just did the job, filling you up with something soft, sweet, and simple enough to remind you there was still goodness in the world. And when you scraped the bottom of the pot, you didn't feel cheated. You felt full. Bologna boats with melted cheese. If you were hungry and broke and had 5 minutes to get dinner on the table, bologna boats had your back. You started with thick-cut slices of bologna, the cheaper, the better, laid flat on a baking sheet. Once they hit the heat, the edges curled up into little bowls, perfect for holding whatever scraps you had. Most nights it was just a scoop of shredded cheese, cheddar, American, or even broken up slices from a crumpled wrapper. You dropped it right in the middle and let it melt until it bubbled and browned, the fat from the bologna sizzling into the tray. If you had crushed crackers, leftover mashed potatoes, or a dollop of mustard, those went in too. But even plain, the smell was enough to bring the whole house to the kitchen. Served with a spoonful of slaw, canned green beans, or nothing at all, bologna boats didn't apologize for what they were. They were salty, greasy, and full of character. Dinner on a dime, comfort without credentials. And when you took that first bite, crunchy edges and molten center, you didn't care how much money you didn't have. It just tasted good. Onion and tomato salad with bread. When the garden was all you had left, you ate what it gave you, and often that meant tomatoes and onions, sharp, juicy, simple. You slice them thick, the onions biting back tears, the tomatoes bleeding juice all over the counter. Toss them together with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of vinegar or oil if you had it. If not, the juices alone did the work. You laid the mixture onto thick slices of bread, or used the bread to soak up the puddle of juice at the bottom of the bowl. It wasn't salad, the way fancy restaurants talked about salad. It was survival in a bowl, sharp, refreshing, and just heavy enough to remind you you were still standing. Onion and tomato salad with bread wasn't built for presentation. It was built for hot kitchens with fans in the windows and not much else in the icebox. And somehow, on the right summer evening, it tasted like the richest thing in the world. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich. In the rural South, it was practically a rite of passage. A ripe banana sliced lengthwise, laid on a thick smear of mayonnaise, and closed inside soft white bread. It sounds like a crime against nature today, but back then it was Saturday lunch, or something a grandmother made with a smile and a wink. The sweetness of the banana met the tang of the mayo, and somehow it worked. Or at least, people told themselves it did. This sandwich was born in kitchens where fruit was rare, and you didn't let anything go brown on the counter. Bananas were a treat, but if you had one, and not much else, mayo and bread made it a meal. It was soft, it was sticky, and it was shockingly filling. Some folks added peanut butter to bridge the gap between sweet and savory. Others swore it needed to be eaten with a glass of milk to wash down the confusion. These days, even mentioning it gets scrunched noses and fake gags. But ask someone who grew up on it, and you'll hear stories, not just about the taste, but about summer days, warm kitchens, and the strange alchemy of poverty and comfort. Cornmeal fried fish, caught locally. When you couldn't afford the butcher, you went to the river, bluegill, catfish, perch. Whatever bit the line that day went into the skillet. You cleaned them quick, dusted them in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped them into a cast iron pan full of hot oil. They fried fast, crispy on the outside, flaky inside. Served with hush puppies or a scoop of grits, it was a meal born from the water and a little grit. Cornmeal fried fish didn't need sauce. It needed time, a sharp knife, and enough oil to do the job right. When dinner hit the table, it didn't last long. Cornbread and buttermilk soup. Some nights, you didn't cook. You just poured and stirred. Cornbread and buttermilk soup was a no-fire dinner, simple, strange, and stubbornly Southern. You crumbled leftover cornbread into a big bowl, chunks, crumbs, whatever you had. Then you poured cold buttermilk over it, just enough to soak the bread and pool around the edges. A spoon did the rest. There was no cooking, no seasoning, just corn, milk, and memory. The flavor was tangy, earthy, and oddly refreshing. It cooled you down in the summer and saved your groceries in the winter. Some folks added salt, others stirred in a little sugar, but most left it alone and just ate. Cornbread and buttermilk wasn't meant to impress. It was a filler, a lifeline, and a legacy all at once. If you grew up on it, it tasted like childhood. If you came to it later, it tasted like surviving without making a fuss. Stuffed bell peppers with rice, no meat version. Stuffed peppers without meat sounded like a punishment. But when times got tough, rice stepped up and carried the weight. You boiled up a pot of white rice, soft but not mushy, stirred in diced onions, maybe a spoonful of tomato paste or leftover sauce from the back of the fridge, a sprinkle of salt, pepper, and if the garden was good to you, some chopped herbs or a bit of garlic. you cut the tops off the bell peppers, green, red, whatever was cheapest, and hollowed them out like little bowls, packed them full of rice mix, and stood them upright in a baking dish. A splash of water or tomato sauce at the bottom kept them from drying out. Baked until the peppers softened and the tops crisped just a little, they came out smelling better than anything made from scraps had a right to. No meat, no cheese, just a pepper filled with hope and starch. And sometimes that was the best thing on the table. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Onion and tomato salad with bread. Sometimes all the garden gave you was onions and tomatoes, and when that happened, you didn't curse it. You built dinner from it. You sliced thick slabs of tomato, the juice running onto the counter, staining everything it touched, peeled and sliced onions so sharp they stung your eyes, tossed both into a big bowl, hit them with a glug of vinegar or oil if there was any to spare, and seasoned with salt and black pepper like you meant it. The bread was day-old, hard around the edges, but you tore it into pieces and let it soak up the juices at the bottom of the bowl. Each bite was a slap of acid, sweet and sharp at the same time, softened by the bread soaking up the life of the vegetables. You didn't set a table for it. You didn't need a knife and fork, just a bowl in your lap, a spoon in your hand, and a hunger that didn't care about fancy cooking. Onion and tomato salad with bread didn't fill you up the way meat would, but it fed something deeper, the memory of sunlight, of dirt under your nails, of survival pulled straight out of stubborn ground. Onion sandwich. A punch to the tongue and a tear in the eye, the onion sandwich didn't pull any punches. It was the sandwich for the bold, the broke, and the blue-collar men who came home reeking of diesel and smoke. One thick slice of raw onion, preferably yellow or white, slapped between two slices of buttered bread. Sometimes it was salted, sometimes not. No cheese. No meat, just the sting of sulfur and the hope that it would fill the belly. This sandwich showed up in mining towns and railroad camps where hearty flavor mattered more than delicacy. It was a poor man's cure for blandness and a test of who could handle it without blinking. Some folks added vinegar or a splash of oil if they had it, but most didn't bother. It was a meal with bite and character, something to chew on while thinking about overdue bills and how long the winter might last. The onion sandwich didn't try to be likable. It was honest, brutal even, but it worked, and in a time when dignity was often the first thing poverty stole, it offered a strange kind of pride. You ate it, wiped your mouth, and got back to work. Mock chicken legs, city chicken. It looked like chicken. It tasted close, but there wasn't a feather in sight. Mock chicken legs, better known in factory towns as city chicken, were skewers of pork or veal dressed up to look like something more expensive. You took small cubes of cheap meat, threaded them tight onto wooden skewers, and breaded them like drumsticks. Then you pan-fried them until golden and crisp, finishing in the oven if you had the time. They came out hot, crunchy on the outside, juicy on the inside, and just familiar enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something finer. Served with mashed potatoes, gravy, canned peas, or just a hunk of white bread, city chicken turned a few scraps of meat into a meal that felt special, even when it wasn't. It wasn't about pretending. It was about working with what you had and making it taste like something worth sitting down for. That was the genius behind poor man's cooking. Oatmeal and bacon. Fat. There were nights when you didn't have sugar. No brown sugar, no syrup, no honey. Just a sack of oats and the old coffee tin of saved bacon grease by the stove. You boiled water, poured in the oats, and stirred until they thickened into something heavy and plain. Then you scooped in a spoonful of bacon fat, greasy, smoky, salted from breakfasts long gone, and stirred until the whole pot took on the flavor of better days. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't delicate, it was salty, hearty, and heavy enough to anchor a man to the ground through another freezing morning. You didn't dress it up. You ate it straight, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, standing at the kitchen counter if the table was already piled with unpaid bills. Oatmeal with bacon fat wasn't a meal you made because you liked it. It was the meal you made because it stayed in your gut like armor. It was heavy and plain and real, and it kept you going when there wasn't much else to hold you up. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans was more than a meal. It was a method. You soaked the dried beans overnight, not because it was fancy cooking, but because the beans were stubborn and needed convincing. Come morning, they went into a big pot with slabs of salt pork, fatty, meaty, salty cuts that were closer to preservation than indulgence. As the pot simmered low and slow, the salt pork broke down, melting its flavor into every bean. The smell filled the house and stuck to the walls, thick, smoky, a scent that promised something worth waiting for. You didn't rush it. You let the beans get soft, the broth thicken, and the salt pork turn tender enough to fall apart under your spoon. Some folks added onions, a pinch of sugar, maybe some black pepper or molasses if the cupboard was generous. It came to the table with nothing but a slice of cornbread or white bread to soak up the juices. It wasn't delicate. It was tough, salty, and heavy in the best way. Salt pork and beans didn't just fill a plate. It filled a family, a workday, a week, and in hard times, that meant everything. Tuna noodle casserole, heavy on noodles. It was never about the tuna. It was about making one can of fish stretch over a whole pan of noodles and come out tasting like something someone might call a casserole. You boiled egg noodles, drained them, and stirred in canned cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and one lone can of tuna, drained and flaked to disappear evenly through the mix. Some folks added peas or shredded cheese if they had it. Most didn't. Everything got dumped into a baking dish and topped with crushed crackers, breadcrumbs, or whatever could add a bit of crunch. Baked until golden, tuna noodle casserole wasn't flashy, but it was warm, soft, and predictable. Three things you clung to when the world outside the oven wasn't. Ketchup sandwich. This was poverty on white bread, pure and unfiltered. The ketchup sandwich was exactly what it sounds like. Slices of plain bread, often store-brand or homemade, slathered with whatever ketchup was available. Sometimes it was Heinz, but more often it was the cheapest bottle on the shelf, or even homemade from surplus tomatoes. This sandwich was the last line of defense between a child and going to bed hungry. It showed up on dinner tables during layoffs, droughts, or long winters when the pantry looked more like a shelf of empty jars than a source of nourishment. Parents told their kids it was just like a burger, just without the meat. and kids played along, licking the tangy sweetness off their fingers. In some households it was toasted to add a bit of crunch, and in others it was folded over to make it feel more like a real sandwich. The ketchup was sugary, acidic, and often watery, but it filled the stomach and added enough flavor to trick the mind into believing it was a meal. There was no pride in it, just resilience. And in a strange way, those who ate it never forgot it. It became a badge of survival, a taste memory tied to struggle, resourcefulness, and the stubborn will to get through another day. Oxtail stew with vegetables. Oxtail wasn't for the faint of heart or the short on time. It was bony, gristly, and cheap. But if you knew what you were doing, it turned into the richest stew on the stove. You browned the pieces first, fat crackling in the pan, then dropped them into a big pot with water, onions, garlic, and whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft yet, carrots, turnips, potatoes. It simmered for hours. The meat slowly pulled from the bone, melting into the broth until it turned thick, savory, and dark as leather. The marrow gave it weight. The vegetables gave it sweetness. The thyme gave it magic. By the end, there wasn't a person at the table who wasn't wiping their bowl clean with bread or fingers. Oxtail stew was proof that patience pays off, even if you started with nothing but bones. Sweet potato and onion hash. You peeled sweet potatoes by hand, rough and quick, the skins curling off onto the counter, diced them into rough cubes. Did the same with a couple onions, sharp, tear-inducing, but necessary. Into a heavy skillet they went, tossed into bacon grease or lard if you had it, into plain oil if you didn't. The sweet potatoes sizzled against the heat, their sugars caramelizing at the edges, while the onions melted into soft, golden strings. You stirred with a wooden spoon, scraping up the bits that stuck to the pan, smelling the sharpness of the onion, mixing with the earthiness of the potatoes. Salt and pepper came next, heavy shakes from old tin shakers. There wasn't any meat on the plate most nights, but nobody complained. Sweet potato and onion hash filled the kitchen with a heavy, rich smell, and it sat in your stomach like a promise that maybe tomorrow wouldn't be so lean. You piled it onto chipped plates, ate it hot, and scraped up every bit. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted, just potatoes, onions, and enough hope fried into every bite to carry you through. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were nights when you didn't bother lighting the stove, when even heating something up felt like too much work for a body already worn thin by the day. That's when the sweetened condensed milk came out. A sticky can pulled from the back of the pantry, pried open with a dull knife if the can opener had gone missing again. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, stale, store-brand, bought on sale, and poured the thick golden milk straight from the can onto the bread. No measuring, no spreading, just a slow, syrupy flood. You slapped the second piece of bread on top and ate it over the sink or standing by the counter, the milk running down your wrists, your mouth glued sweet shut. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't balanced. It was sugar and fat and survival packed into 2 trembling slices of bread. And somehow it made you feel full, even when everything else felt hollow. Sweetened, condensed milk sandwiches didn't need recipes. They didn't need silverware. They needed hunger, a little sweetness, and the stubbornness to find joy wherever you could. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were times when there wasn't meat, cheese, or even peanut butter left in the house, but there might be a dusty can of sweetened condensed milk tucked away in the pantry, and if there was, you had yourself dinner. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, soft if you were lucky, stale if you weren't, and poured thick, slow ribbons of condensed milk right across the middle. The milk pooled, heavy, glistening, sticky enough to glue the bread together without even trying. You folded the bread closed and bit down fast before it all ran down your wrists. The milk was sweet beyond sweet, dense with sugar and fat, coating your tongue and hitting your stomach like a stone wrapped in velvet. Some folks drizzled extra sugar over the top. Others dusted it with cinnamon or nutmeg if there was anything fancy left in the spice cabinet. But it didn't need it. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches weren't meals you served with pride. They were meals you served because sugar was calories, and calories were survival. And for a few sticky, glorious minutes, they made the world seem a little softer. Boiled eggs and toast. You boiled the eggs hard. No soft yolks, no fancy techniques. Just a rolling pot of water and a handful of eggs, cooked until they were solid through. You peeled them at the table, steam rising from your fingertips. Slice them, or mash them right onto toasted bread, maybe with a dab of mustard or a shake of salt if the day had gone well. Sometimes there was butter. Most times just dry toast and the egg to carry it. It was quiet food, the kind you ate with your head down, not because you were ashamed, but because you were too tired to talk. Boiled eggs and toast didn't fill the house with the smell of dinner. It didn't need to. It just filled the body and gave you enough to get through the rest of the night. Simple, soft, and steady. That was the power in it. Fried rice with whatever? Leftovers. Fried rice was never planned. It was built from what got left behind. Cold rice, scraps of meat, half an onion, a spoonful of peas hiding in the back of the freezer. You dumped it all into a hot skillet slicked with bacon, grease, oil, or whatever fat you had. Fried it fast, stirred it hard, scraped the bottom to catch all the crispy bits. If you had an egg, you scrambled it in. If you didn't, you added more rice. Soy sauce was a blessing. Salt and pepper were the usual stand-ins. It didn't matter what went in. The result was always the same. Hot, savory, full of flavor and heat. A spoonful of fried rice filled more than your belly. It filled the gap between not knowing what to cook and making something that felt like real food. And when it was gone, you were full. That was all it had to be. Noodle and ketchup skillet. This wasn't spaghetti. This was survival. You boiled a handful of dry noodles, elbows, egg noodles, whatever was cheapest. And when they were soft, you drained them and dumped them back into the skillet. Then came the ketchup, not sauce, ketchup. Squeezed straight from the bottle, stirred in until the noodles turned red and slippery. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper. Some folks added chopped onion, if they had it, or a cube of butter to smooth it out. You let it sizzle for a minute, the ketchup caramelizing just enough to smell like something more than what it was. It hit the plate hot, sweet, and tangy. It wasn't trying to taste like Italian food. It wasn't trying to taste like anything but enough. Noodle and ketchup skillet didn't pretend. It filled the belly and stretched the budget. And for families who didn't have meat or cheese or even a can of tomato sauce, it got the job done. Tomato sandwich. When the tomatoes were ripe and falling off the vine faster than they could be canned, the tomato sandwich reigned supreme. Thick, juicy slices of homegrown tomato, deep red and bursting with flavor, were laid across soft bread smeared with mayonnaise or butter. Salt and pepper crowned the top. That was it. It didn't pretend to be anything fancy. But in the heat of a southern summer, with sweat dripping and sunburn setting in, nothing tasted more alive. The tomato sandwich was seasonal salvation. It was the joy of growing your own food, the pride of a backyard garden feeding a family of 7. Kids came in from chores with sunburnt arms and dirt under their nails, and this was what waited on the table. Soggy bread, red juice running down fingers, the tang of salt and acid on the tongue. It was messy and marvelous. When meat was too expensive and store trips were rare, this sandwich filled the gap. It was cheap, abundant, and for a brief moment in August, tasted like luxury. People remembered it long after they could afford more. Cornbread pancakes. Cornbread pancakes weren't a recipe you measured. They were a recipe you remembered because there was nothing else left in the kitchen. You took cornmeal, cheap, gritty, and honest, and stirred it with water, maybe a little salt if you still had any. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just the barest things that could stretch into food. You heated a cast iron skillet, slicked it with bacon grease if you had it, or just rubbed it with lard or oil. Then you dropped spoonfuls of batter straight into the sizzling pan. They spread out into ragged circles, edges bubbling and crisping before you flip them over with a battered spatula or just the edge of a knife. They came off the skillet golden, hot, and smelling better than they had any right to. You ate them stacked up with a smear of sorghum syrup if you were lucky, or plain if you weren't. They soaked up whatever you poured over them, soft in the center, crunchy at the edges. Cornbread pancakes didn't pretend to be a feast. They were rough, fast, and filling, fuel to get you through one more day without breaking under the weight of it all. And somehow, that was enough. Fried bologna sandwiches. Fried bologna sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. You slapped a slice of bologna onto a hot skillet and watched it puff and curl at the edges like a cheap umbrella turning inside out. Sometimes you scored little cuts around the edge to keep it flat. Sometimes you just let it go wild. Either way, you dropped it between 2 slices of white bread, maybe with a smear of mustard or a scrap of cheese if you had it, and called it dinner. The fat crisped around the edges. The middle stayed juicy and salty. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't last long once it hit your hands. Fried bologna sandwiches were food for the tired, the broke, and the too dang busy to care about anything more than getting something hot and salty into their mouths before collapsing into bed. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard, no runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them, and every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Buttered noodles with black pepper. When money got tight and the day was long, buttered noodles with pepper was the meal that answered back. Boil pasta, any kind. Drain it, drop in a stick of butter, or however much was left, and stir until every noodle was coated and shiny. Then hit it with the black pepper. A lot of black pepper, no cheese, no sauce, just butter, heat, and pepper, sharp enough to make your mouth pay attention. Served in a bowl, eaten with a spoon, and maybe chased with a piece of bread, it didn't pretend to be anything but what it was: simple, fast, and filling. Exactly what you needed at the end of the kind of day you didn't want to talk about. Fried apples and biscuits. You peeled and sliced the apples thin, tossed them in a skillet with butter, or bacon grease if that's all you had, and sprinkled sugar over the top like a memory. They fried down slow, turning golden and soft, the sugar bubbling into syrup, and the fruit collapsing into sweet, sticky ribbons. Meanwhile, you baked up a batch of biscuits from scratch. Just flour, lard, baking powder, and water if that was all the pantry allowed. They came out uneven but hot, split down the middle, and steaming. You spooned the fried apples right on top, let the syrup soak in, ate it with your hands or a fork, depending on how tired the day had made you. It wasn't breakfast, it wasn't dessert, it was just food, sweet, simple, and so good it almost made you forget how little was in the icebox. Fried apples and biscuits reminded you that comfort didn't need cost. It needed heat, time, and a little sugar. Potato cakes with onion. It started with leftovers, the kind nobody really wanted until you gave them a second life. Cold, mashed potatoes, stiff from the fridge, got dumped into a bowl and mixed with chopped onion, a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one. You shaped the mixture into heavy patties and dropped them into a hot skillet, greased with whatever fat was left. The outside crisped golden brown, forming a crust that cracked when your fork hit it. Inside, the potatoes turned creamy again, the onions soft and sweet. You didn't need toppings. No ketchup, no sour cream. Just a stack of hot cakes on a plate and the steam rising to meet you. Some nights they were breakfast, some nights dinner, sometimes both. They didn't last long on the table, and they didn't need help to taste like comfort. Potato cakes with onion reminded you that even the things people thought were done, cold, unwanted, forgotten, could come back better than before. All they needed was a little heat and someone willing to try. Ketchup sandwiches. You didn't eat a ketchup sandwich because you loved it. You ate it because the fridge was empty and ketchup was still there. Spread across soft bread, or stiff bread if that's all you had, it gave sweetness, tang, and color to an otherwise blank meal. You folded it over and ate it fast, maybe with a little shame, maybe with a quiet laugh. It filled you, barely, but sometimes barely was enough. Ketchup sandwiches were desperation wrapped in softness, a last resort that still showed up when everything else was gone. Lard and salt sandwich. It was a sandwich that didn't whisper luxury. It shouted survival. In the rural stretches of America, especially the South and parts of Appalachia, lard was more than a cooking fat. It was sustenance in a jar. When meat was scarce and butter too expensive, folks would smear thick layers of pork lard onto stale slices of white bread, sometimes warmed just enough to soften, then sprinkle on salt for taste. The bread was often homemade or store-bought at a discount rack, day-old, maybe mold-trimmed. This sandwich had no fancy name, but for the working poor, it filled bellies and kept the body going for hours of farm work, factory shifts, or walking long distances. Some added cracked black pepper, a dash of vinegar, or a sliver of onion, if the garden allowed it. Kids sometimes brought them to school, wrapped in wax paper or newspaper. It was greasy, heavy, and left a white film on the fingers. But it was calories. It was comfort. And above all, it was cheap. It told the story of a family doing the best they could with the scraps life handed them. And despite its humble ingredients, There was something oddly warming about it, like the fat itself carried the memory of the hog butchering season, smokehouses, and kinfolk gathered around a wood stove in winter. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. It didn't matter if the pantry was bare and the neighbors were eating better. If you had a sack of rice, a stick of butter, and a battered tin of cinnamon sugar, you had dinner that could almost make you feel rich. You boiled the rice until it was tender, grains puffed and clinging together in a warm heap. While it steamed, you dropped in a knob of butter, big if the week was good, small if it wasn't, and let it melt slow, pooling at the bottom. You took a spoon, stirred it all together, then showered the rice with cinnamon and sugar until the air smelled sweeter than anything money could buy. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meat and potatoes. But when you sat down with a bowl of it, steaming in your hands, every bite tasted like a quiet kind of victory. The butter made it rich, the cinnamon made it bright, and the sugar made it enough to keep the cold out and the tiredness away. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't a dessert. It was survival made sweet, and it stuck to your ribs in a way no fancy dinner ever could. Mustard sandwiches, 2 slices of bread, a smear of mustard. That was it. But when that was all there was, it was enough. You spread it thick, yellow, and sharp over whatever bread you had, fresh, stale, or halfway to toast. Folded it over, or ate it open-faced, maybe with a shake of salt if you needed more flavor. There was no protein, no side dish, just bite after bite of tang and chew. Mustard sandwiches weren't meals you planned. They were meals that happened when payday didn't. And somehow they carried you to the next one. It wasn't about taste. It was about not giving up. Hot dog and potato hash. It was a scramble, a messy, glorious scramble of chopped hot dogs and diced potatoes fried hard in a big skillet, the potatoes browned and crisped at the edges. The hot dogs split and sizzled, their skins blistering in the heat. Sometimes an onion found its way into the pan. Sometimes a leftover scrap of cheese melted over the top if you had something fancy like that lying around. You piled it onto a plate, doused it with ketchup or mustard if you wanted, and ate standing up at the stove because sitting down took too long. Hot dog and potato hash wasn't a meal you planned. It was a meal you survived, and most nights that was good enough. Cold rice with syrup or molasses. There were nights when there wasn't time or energy to cook again. You opened the icebox and pulled out the cold pot of leftover rice, stuck together in clumps, but still good enough. You scooped it into bowls with a big metal spoon, the grains sticking together in cool, chewy mounds. Then you drizzled syrup, cheap corn syrup if you had it, molasses if you were blessed, over the top, letting it sink down into the cracks like rain into dry earth. You stirred just enough to coat it, breaking up the clumps until the rice glistened brown and sticky. Some added a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon if there was a jar left half full in the cabinet. Most just ate it as it was, cold, sweet, heavy. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't hot, but it was food. And when you were so tired that even lighting the stove felt impossible, it was a quiet salvation. Cold rice with syrup wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about using every scrap, eating until you were full, and reminding yourself that tomorrow, somehow, would come anyway. Prune sandwich. Yes, prunes. Those wrinkled little fruit grenades that kids today associate with digestion and old folks. But 50 to 70 years ago, a prune sandwich wasn't weird. It was practical, especially if Grandma had a jar of stewed prunes cooling on the stove. The syrupy sweetness soaked into a piece of soft bread. Then a few soft mashed prunes were spooned on and smashed between the slices. Sometimes butter was added to cut the sweetness, sometimes cinnamon. Often nothing at all. This was sugar when sugar was scarce. It was a child's after-school snack or a quick breakfast for a father running late to the mill. Prunes were affordable, available in bulk, and didn't go bad easily. They were sweet enough to pass as dessert and heavy enough to calm a grumbling stomach. To modernize, it's hard to imagine putting prunes in a sandwich and calling it lunch. But to people who made everything stretch, who preserved fruit in cellars and reused wax paper until it fell apart, it was a small luxury wrapped in practicality, sweet, sticky, and stained into memory. Split pea soup with ham hocks. Split pea soup didn't care what day of the week it was. It was cheap, thick, and hot. And if you had a ham hock to throw in the pot, you were eating better than most. You started with dried green peas, rinsed clean, and boiled low and slow with onions, garlic, maybe a chopped carrot, if there was one, lying around. The ham hock went in whole, bone and all, bringing fat, smoke, and salt to every corner of the broth. Hours passed, and the peas melted into a creamy stew. The meat softened until it slid off the bone in rich, chewy shreds. Some folks added potatoes. Some didn't. Either way, it came to the table thick enough to stand a spoon in. You served it with crusty bread or just ate it out of a chipped bowl in silence. It didn't need sides. It didn't need help. Split pea soup with ham hocks wasn't pretty, but it was dependable, it was filling, and it turned the cheapest bag of legumes into something worth scraping every drop from the pot. Lard fried bread with sugar. When butter ran out, lard stepped in. When jam and syrup were gone, sugar took their place. And when there wasn't much of anything else, you fried up slices of bread in hot lard, sprinkled sugar over the top, and called it dinner. The bread crisped at the edges and browned in the middle, soaking up the fat until it was golden and rich. The sugar melted just enough to form a crackling top layer that crunched between your teeth. You served it hot off the skillet, fingers greasy, faces sticky. It wasn't light, it wasn't healthy, but it was sweet, warm, and fast. Lard-fried bread with sugar was the kind of meal you made when you needed to give someone something to smile about and had almost nothing to work with. It didn't last long, not on the plate, not in memory. But for 5 minutes, it felt like a treat. Brown sugar and butter bread. When money ran out but the need for something sweet didn't, brown sugar and butter bread showed up. It was cheap, fast, and good enough to make the youngest kids smile and the oldest Wests remember better times. You took a slice of bread, fresh if you had it, stale if you didn't care, and spread it thick with butter, or margarine if real butter was a dream that week. Then you grabbed a handful of brown sugar and sprinkled it heavy over the top, letting it soak into the butter until it turned glossy and wet. Sometimes you toasted it. Sometimes you just ate it straight, the sugar crunching between your teeth, the butter slick and salty against the back of your throat. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't a meal you wrote letters about, but it was sweet. It filled the gap between dinner and bedtime when the real desserts cost too much or didn't exist at all. Brown sugar and butter bread was poor man's candy, Depression-era cake, and a 5-minute reminder that comfort didn't need to come wrapped in a box or bought from a store. It could come from what you already had, and that was enough. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Nobody planted dandelions. They just grew, and when money was tight, that made them the most reliable crop around. Dandelion greens were bitter, wild, and free. And when boiled and dressed with vinegar, they became dinner. You picked them young, before the leaves turned tough and angry. gave them a good wash to get the dirt and bugs out, then boiled them down until they wilted into a deep green tangle. Some folks fried a bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. Others just added a splash of vinegar and hoped it was enough. The taste was sharp, earthy, and strong. It hit your mouth like a warning and went down like a challenge. But it filled you, and it reminded you that nature didn't care about the price of groceries. If you were willing to look low, it would feed you. Served with cornbread or a slice of white bread, dandelion greens with vinegar was never anyone's favorite meal, but it was there when you needed it. And in hard times, that made it special. Dried apple and a rice bake. When the harvests were bad and the fruit ran low, people turned to dried apples stored in sacks in the pantry. They were tough, wrinkled, and needed coaxing to come back to life. But with a little patience and a lot of need, they turned into something filling. You boiled the dried apples first, softened them back into something resembling fruit, sweetened them lightly with sugar or a dash of syrup if you could spare it. Then you stirred them into a pot of cooked white rice stretched thin, boiled soft with a little extra water because every grain had to count. Sometimes there was a splash of milk stirred in to make it creamy. Sometimes just a little cinnamon to trick the nose into thinking you were baking something fancy. You poured the whole mess into a greased baking dish and slid it into the oven. Baked it slow until the top crusted just a little, the apples sinking into the soft rice below. It wasn't dessert and it wasn't dinner, it was both. Warm, heavy, sweet enough to feel like a treat, but strong enough to fill the gap between a long day and a longer night. Dried apple and rice bake wasn't indulgence. It was endurance with a little bit of sweetness. Cabbage roll. Casserole, lazy man's version. Cabbage rolls were beautiful. Cabbage roll casserole was practical. You didn't have time to roll leaves and tie them up nice. You had 5 kids, 1 oven, and no meat to waste. You browned a little beef, or none at all, mixed it with cooked rice, onions, and canned tomato sauce. Chopped cabbage got layered in a baking dish. Then the rice mixture, then more cabbage, and more sauce. You baked it covered until the cabbage went soft and the rice soaked up all the tangy, smoky juice. It came out messy, bubbling, fork tender, and full of soul. You didn't care how it looked. It tasted like something much fancier. Lazy man's cabbage roll casserole wasn't lazy. It was survival with a little creative license. And when it hit the table, nobody questioned how much effort went into it. They just ate, and that was enough. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had, potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing. Peanut butter and pickle sandwich. This wasn't a dare. It was a Depression-era miracle that stuck around through sheer audacity. Spread salty peanut butter on soft white bread. Then top it with a few slices of dill pickle. That's it. The sharp vinegar of the pickle cut through the dry stickiness of the peanut butter like lightning. For some, it was a flavor revolution. For others, an act of desperation. Either way, it filled a lunchbox, silenced a growling stomach, and left a memory that outlasted hunger. This odd pairing was often born from leftovers, the last bit of peanut butter clinging to the jar, and a few pickles floating lonely in brine. The sandwich traveled in wax paper to schoolyards and rail cars. It didn't need refrigeration, didn't spoil fast, and made a little go a long way. Some added mustard for an extra jolt. Some swore by sweet pickles instead of dill, but the essence was the same: salty, sour, sticky, survival. It was a sandwich that shouldn't work, but did, just like the people who ate it. Mashed rutabagas with bacon grease. Rutabagas weren't glamorous. They were hard, knobby, bitter if you didn't cook them right. But when boiled until soft and mashed with a heavy spoonful of bacon grease, they became something earthy, smoky, and surprisingly filling. You peeled them with a paring knife, chopped them into rough cubes, and boiled them until they yielded to the fork. Then came the mashing, bare hands, strong wrists, and just enough bacon fat to smooth it all out. Salt, pepper, maybe a bit of chopped onion. That was it. You served them warm, heavy, and humble. No side dishes. Just a plate of mashed rutabaga, steaming and honest. It was food from the ground, flavored by scraps, carried by effort, and when you ate it, you remembered the old folks who taught you how to cook it, because they had no other choice. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits. Gravy didn't need drippings. It didn't need sausage. Sometimes it didn't even need meat at all. It needed cornmeal, water, and stubbornness. You browned a handful of cornmeal in a hot skillet, stirring it steady, letting it go just dark enough to smell like roasted corn. Then you poured in water, slow, careful, and kept stirring until it thickened into something closer to porridge than gravy. Salt, pepper, maybe a crack of cayenne if you were lucky enough to have a spice tin tucked away. You split open rough-made biscuits, flour, water, and lard slapped together and baked quick, and poured the cornmeal gravy over the top, hot and heavy. It wasn't silky, it wasn't pretty. It was thick, hearty, and stuck to your ribs like the memory of every hard season you'd lived through. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits wasn't something you served to company. It was something you served to family, to tired hands, to empty pockets. And for all its plainness, it filled you with a warmth that no fancy sauce ever could. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches. When meat was a luxury and cheese was a memory, you made do with eggs, boiled hard, chopped rough, and stretched to feed a family. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches were the quick answer when the cupboards echoed and the paycheck hadn't come yet. You boiled the eggs until the yolks turned chalky and firm, peeled them while they were still steaming, the shells crackling under your fingers. Then you mashed them up with the back of a fork, stirred in a splash of vinegar, sharp and biting, and maybe a little salt and pepper, if you had any left. No mayonnaise, no butter, just eggs and vinegar piled high onto slices of white bread. The vinegar soaked into the bread a little, cutting through the richness of the yolks and making every bite pop sharp against your tongue. Sometimes you added a few slices of onion for crunch. Sometimes it was just the eggs and the bite of vinegar, enough to fill the air with that unmistakable, mouth-watering tang. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. But it kept you moving, kept the kids from crying at night, and reminded you that protein didn't always come in fancy packages. Sometimes it came boiled, smashed, and served between two tired slices of bread. Potato soup with saltine crackers. It didn't get much simpler. or more stubborn than potato soup. You peeled and chopped potatoes rough, boiled them with a little salt until they softened, then mashed them half-heartedly right there in the broth. A splash of milk if you had it, a pat of butter if you could spare it. Otherwise, just water and starch and the quiet satisfaction of knowing there'd be something hot in every bowl. Saltines sat in a chipped tin on the counter. You crushed them over the soup, letting them melt into the broth, thickening it just enough to feel heavy on the spoon. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even fancy enough to pretend. But it filled your belly, warmed your hands, and reminded you that even when the cupboards were thin, dinner still showed up if you worked for it. White gravy and biscuits. Some days all you had was flour, grease, and a few scraps of baking powder to rub together into something that looked like dinner. White gravy and biscuits didn't need anything else. You stirred bacon fat or lard into a bubbling skillet, whisked in flour until it turned the color of toast, and then thinned it with water or milk into a thick, creamy flood of pure, peppery survival. The biscuits didn't need to be pretty, just rough mounds of dough baked until they barely held together, perfect for soaking up every drop of that heavy, salty gravy. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about hunger. About making sure nobody went to bed empty. About knowing that sometimes a plate of bread and sauce was enough to carry you through whatever the world had lined up next. Boiled potatoes with canned green beans. You started with the potatoes, peeled or not depending on time and preference, boiled them in salted water until they were soft enough to mash with a fork but not falling apart. Then you dumped in a can of green beans, liquid and all, and let everything simmer together for a few minutes. The beans took on the starch of the potatoes. The potatoes took on the salt of the beans. Some folks drained it and served it with butter. Others left it as is, watery and plain, and ladled it out into bowls. It was a no-fuss meal, warm and gentle on the stomach, something to serve the kids when the money had run dry, but dinner still had to happen. It didn't look like much, and it wasn't meant to, but it got the job done. Hot food, fast, and enough for everyone to get seconds. Macaroni and tomatoes. There was nothing glamorous about boiled macaroni dumped into a skillet full of canned tomatoes, but when you were broke, it tasted like pure genius. The macaroni soaked up the sharp, sweet tang of the tomatoes, stretching a 50-cent can and a handful of dry noodles into a meal that could feed 3 kids and still have a little left over for tomorrow. Salt, pepper, maybe a knob of butter if you were lucky. That was it. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan showers, just tomatoey, slippery noodles on a chipped plate, steaming in the kitchen while the radio played something soft in the background. Mashed potato pancakes. Leftover mashed potatoes weren't thrown out. They were transformed. Mashed potato pancakes were second-day salvation, a meal built from scraps that tasted better than most things made fresh. You started with cold, stiff mashed potatoes, lumpy, buttery, maybe a little dry. Stir in an egg if you had one, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt. Some folks added chopped onions. Others tossed in a handful of cheese or herbs when they were lucky. You formed the mixture into thick, heavy patties and laid them into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped up golden and crackly, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The smell alone was enough to pull kids to the kitchen like a dinner bell. No need for sides, just a stack of hot cakes, maybe a dab of sour cream or a shake of pepper on top. They were cheap, filling, and made from nothing new. But when your fork cracked through that crust into the steaming middle, it didn't feel like leftovers. It felt like a quiet little miracle. Sugar sandwich. It was the kind of thing whispered about in lunchrooms, but devoured in the privacy of a dim kitchen. Just a slice of white bread, cheap, soft, and without character, smeared with margarine, then sprinkled generously with white sugar. Sometimes the bread was folded in half, like a taco. Other times, stacked with another slice to mimic the real thing. In homes where meat was a luxury and cereal was a Sunday-only treat, the sugar sandwich became a last resort, a dessert, or even breakfast. The margarine, often from a government-issued block or a tub of oleo, would soften into the crumb of the bread, creating a greasy glue that held the sugar in place. Every bite crunched with the sound of crystals grinding against teeth, and for a few seconds the world didn't seem quite so empty. This sandwich came alive, especially during the early mornings before school or late at night when dinner was missed or stretched too thin. It was a favorite among children who didn't know any better, and a quiet shame for parents who wished they could give more, but it also tasted like stolen joy, a cheap thrill in a world where there weren't many. Cold meatloaf sandwiches. Meatloaf always got better the second day, once the fat firmed up and the seasoning settled into every bite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were about making yesterday's scraps into today's prize. You cut thick slices straight from the fridge, slapped them onto white bread, and squirted a heavy line of mustard across the top. No fancy toasters, no fancy sauces, just meat, bread, and whatever dignity you could scrape together on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes a slice of onion made it into the sandwich. Sometimes just a pickle on the side. Either way, it was sturdy, heavy, and enough to keep you moving until quitting time.